In the shadowed corridors of Imperial Russia, where palaces gleamed with gold and peasants froze in fields of ice, one man rose from the mud to sit beside the throne. He came not with titles, nor wealth, nor an army, but with eyes, piercing, hypnotic, eyes that some swore could see your soul and steal it. His name was whispered in fear and fascination: Grigory Rasputin, the peasant prophet, the mad monk, the devil in robes. To some, he was a healer, a mystic sent by God. To others, a heretic, drunk on power and debauchery. To history, he remains a mystery. Tonight, we unravel the life of a man who seduced an empire and helped destroy it. Prepare for strange miracles, twisted rituals, forbidden love, political madness, and a death so bizarre, it became legend. This is the story of Grigory Rasputin. Chapter 1. Siberian Beginnings. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was born in January of 1869 in a cold, windswept village called Pokrovskoye. Tucked deep in the Siberian wilderness, it was a place where superstition reigned, and the church bells were often the only sign of civilization. His family were peasant farmers, poor, illiterate. Harsh winters meant frequent death. There were no comforts, only God and survival. But even among the villagers, little Grigory was different. Stories say he had a stare that unsettled grown men. He barely spoke. He wandered alone into forests for hours, sometimes days. He had visions, at least he said he did. Bright lights, voices, glimpses of saints. He was never taught to read, never went to school, but he knew things. Animals calmed around him. Sick villagers whispered of his touch. He could find lost cattle, predict storms. Some said he could even read minds. By the age of 12, locals began to fear him as much as they admired him. Fact, in Siberian folklore, starets, or holy wanderers, were often revered as prophets. Some were believed to have divine gifts. Rasputin later modeled himself after these wandering mystics. At 18, Rasputin married a peasant girl named Praskovia. They had children, one of whom, Maria, would later write about his life. But domestic life didn't suit him. Something burned inside him. A calling, a madness, maybe both. And so, one night, without a goodbye, he left. On foot. No money, no food, just a sack and the voice of God in his head. Chapter 2. Pilgrim or prophet. He left his village with nothing but calloused feet and a fire in his chest. No map, no destination. Just a belief that somewhere out there, far beyond the rivers and frozen roads, God was waiting to speak to him. Grigory Rasputin wandered across Russia like a ghost. He slept in stables, ate when strangers took pity, prayed for hours beside frozen lakes. He stopped at remote monasteries, begging the monks to teach him. But he wasn't looking for rituals or scripture. He wanted something deeper, something raw, something real. Whispers followed him. Some said he joined a group called the Callists, a forbidden sect that believed the soul could only be purified through sin. They flogged themselves, danced in circles until collapsing, and believed ecstasy, spiritual and physical, brought them closer to God. No one could prove Rasputin was part of them, but the stories matched too well. He believed pleasure was not the enemy of holiness. He believed sin was the gateway to salvation. He gained a reputation, not in cities, but in villages, among the desperate. They spoke of a man who could find lost animals, ease fevers, calm seizures. When he touched the sick, some got better. When he prayed, people claimed the pain stopped. No one knew where he came from, or how he knew these things. He had no books, no holy orders, but people began calling him a man of God. By the early 1900s, he walked with confidence, a tall, wiry figure with piercing eyes and a beard that hung like a prophet's. His clothes were rags, but his presence silenced rooms. And then, one winter, he stepped into St. Petersburg. It was the capital of the Russian Empire, rich, proud, drowning in decadence and decay. Nobles held seances in marble salons. Spiritualism was fashionable. The elite, bored with tradition, were searching for magic. Into this glittering world walked a barefoot peasant with tangled hair and a smell of smoke and sweat. He didn't bow. He didn't flatter. He spoke like thunder and stared like he knew your secrets. The aristocracy should have laughed at him. Instead, they listened. He began visiting drawing rooms, speaking of visions, of saints, of healing. They called it wild, primitive. But they invited him back, and again, and again. Women wept in his presence. Men claimed to feel lighter after hearing his voice. He never raised his tone, but no one dared interrupt. Something about him was magnetic, terrifying, irresistible. He said things that no priest would dare. That sin brought you closer to God. That the flesh was not shameful, but sacred. That the path to heaven was soaked in human desire. And then he'd close his eyes and speak of angels. He became a curiosity, then a sensation, and then something else. In 1905, through a connection with a prominent bishop, Rasputin was introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina. Russia's rulers, Nicholas and Alexandra, were drowning in quiet despair. Their son, Alexei, had been born with hemophilia, a disorder that turned even the smallest bruise into a potential death sentence. No doctor could save him. No priest could help. Every injury was a gamble with fate. When Rasputin entered their chambers, he didn't kneel. He didn't panic. He placed his hand on the boy. He prayed, and within hours, the bleeding stopped. Some say it was coincidence. Others say he hypnotized the child into calming down. Alexandra believed it was a miracle. From that moment, she saw Rasputin as divinely sent. Not a man, but a vessel, a chosen one. She wrote to him as our friend, our savior. She begged him to stay close. She trusted him more than the court physicians, more than her advisors, more than her own family. Rasputin had done the impossible. He walked into the heart of the empire, uninvited, unwanted, and left with the ear of a queen. Behind palace doors, his voice grew louder, his presence more permanent. And in the quiet corridors of power, a peasant was becoming something greater than a noble, more feared than a minister, and more seductive than anyone could imagine. But nothing in Russia stays secret forever. Eyes were watching, and knives were already being sharpened. Chapter 3. Enter the Romanovs. By the early 1900s, the House of Romanov was 300 years old. A dynasty built on blood and faith, it ruled over 1/6 of the earth. But beneath the glittering palaces and sacred icons, the foundation was crumbling. Nicholas II sat on the throne, not with ambition, but with a heavy crown he never asked for. He was a deeply religious man, a father first and Tsar second. He believed God chose him, not the people. And because of that, he refused to bend, not to ministers, not to uprisings, not even to fate. His wife, Alexandra, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, British by blood, German by birth, Russian by force. She had never been fully accepted by the court. They called her cold, distant, too proud. But they didn't see the woman behind closed doors. the one who paced the floors each night, wringing her hands, praying for her son to survive. Alexei was their only male heir, and he was dying in silence. Born with hemophilia, the boy's blood refused to clot. A bruise could cripple him. A fall could kill him. There were days he screamed in agony for hours, his joints swollen with internal bleeding. Doctors could do nothing. Priests gave comfort, not healing. Every episode brought him closer to death, and every episode brought Alexandra closer to despair. Then came Rasputin. He was no one, just a peasant from Siberia, with wild eyes and the stench of smoke and sweat. But someone whispered his name. Someone said he had healed others, that he prayed and pain stopped, that he saw things others couldn't. In 1905, Rasputin was brought quietly into the royal circle. There was no grand introduction, no ceremony, just a meeting, late at night, in the palace nursery. He stood beside the Tsarevich's bed, placed his hand gently on the boy's chest, and began to pray. Not with chanting, not with Latin, but in a soft, rhythmic tone, like a lullaby whispered from heaven. Within hours, the bleeding slowed, the pain eased, the boy slept. It was the first peaceful night Alexandra had known in months. She was convinced Rasputin was sent by God. From that day forward, he became more than a healer. He became part of the family. Alexandra began writing him letters, dozens, hundreds over the years, filled with desperation, gratitude, longing. She called him our friend, our guide, my beloved. She believed he was the only one who could save her son, and by extension, the empire. Rasputin knew exactly what she needed: certainty. In a court of backstabbers and cowards, he spoke with conviction. Where priests offered vague promises, he made guarantees. He gave her hope, not through theology, but through presence. Soon, he was no longer just visiting when Alexei was ill. He was appearing in the palace weekly, then daily. He walked the halls like a lord. Chambermaids curtsied, guards opened doors, ministers waited to be summoned. He drank their wine, blessed their children, sat with the royal family like an uncle or prophet. He didn't dress the part. His robe was often stained, his beard unkempt. But when he entered a room, everyone fell silent. There was something about him. He stared too long, smiled too slowly. He could insult a duke without raising his voice, could silence a bishop with a glance. No one knew what he'd say next. No one knew what he was truly thinking. That unpredictability made him both fascinating and terrifying. Soon, Alexandra began asking his advice on matters far beyond medicine. Who should be appointed as Minister of War? Which general was loyal? Which clergyman should be promoted? Rasputin answered as if God whispered the answers to him directly. Nicholas was hesitant. He never fully trusted Rasputin, but he trusted Alexandra. She begged him, pleaded, swore that their son's life depended on it, and so the Tsar gave ground, first in private matters, then in politics. One by one, Rasputin's enemies were dismissed: generals, governors, archbishops. Anyone who questioned his presence was labeled disloyal to the crown, or worse, to God. And all the while, Rasputin was growing bolder. He wandered the palace at all hours. He began inviting noblewomen to his quarters for private prayer. Some said he laid hands on them for healing. Others said he offered something far more intimate. There were whispers that he believed the path to divine cleansing ran through flesh, that to sin with Rasputin was to be purified by him. And yet, they kept coming back. Some said it was hypnosis. Others believed he used drugs, herbs, potions. But maybe, just maybe, it was simpler than that. Maybe Rasputin simply made people feel seen, understood, important. He gave them what they didn't get from their husbands, their priests, their rulers: attention, connection, power. Outside the palace, the people began to notice. They were starving. Bread lines stretched for blocks. The factories were failing. Soldiers were dying. Revolution was bubbling in the gutters. And yet, here was a drunken monk, dirty, arrogant, untouchable, drinking wine in the winter palace and whispering in the empress's ear. Cartoons appeared in newspapers, showing Rasputin as a spider weaving a web around the Romanovs. Others portrayed him as a snake coiled around Alexandra. One brutal image showed him leering from behind a crucifix while the empire burned around him. The church denounced him. The Duma demanded his removal. Noble families began meeting in secret, furious that a Siberian peasant now held the power of kings. But Rasputin didn't flinch. He told the Tsarina not to worry, that their enemies were heretics, that he would pray for them, that all would be well. And she believed him. The worse things became outside the palace, the deeper Alexandra clung to her holy man. As revolution crept through the streets, she closed the curtains and read Rasputin's letters, trusting that God still protected her throne. But even Rasputin, drunk on his own legend, must have felt the winds shifting. The generals hated him. The politicians feared him. The public despised him. And some of the Romanovs themselves, distant cousins and grand dukes, were now asking the same question behind closed doors. If we cannot remove him from power, should we remove him from life? Chapter 4. The Seducer in Silk Robes. To understand Rasputin's power, you have to forget politics, forget royal connections, forget even the miracles. His real weapon was seduction, not just of bodies, but of minds, of attention, of need. Rasputin understood seduction on a level few ever master. He didn't chase women. He didn't charm with flowers or poems. He invaded them, spiritually, psychologically, physically. He used silence like a weapon. His pauses made people lean closer. His words were heavy, slow, deliberate, as if they came from God himself. He made you feel seen, not admired, not adored, known. And for many women in Russia's rigid, suffocating aristocracy, that was enough to tear down every wall they had. He found his way into the bedrooms of the empire's most powerful wives and daughters without ever raising his voice. They came to him, desperate, curious, lonely, sometimes broken, always intrigued. One countess wrote in her diary, "He looked at me, and I felt unclean, but not ashamed, as though he could see my sins and welcomed them." Another noblewoman described their first encounter. She came to him for healing. Her heart raced constantly, her nerves shot. He laid his hand on her chest and said nothing for 5 full minutes. No prayer, no chant, just pressure and breath. Then he whispered, "Your heart is not sick. It is starving." She returned to him 3 nights later, alone. Many of these women were trapped in loveless marriages, raised in a society where emotion was weakness and desire was sinful. They had never been looked at the way Rasputin looked at them, not with lust, but with hunger, curiosity, and what felt like holy permission. He told them sin was necessary, that to truly reach God, one had to first fall, that the soul could not ascend until the body was free. These weren't just ideas. They were experiences, rituals. He made sin feel sacred. One particularly infamous account came from a married noblewoman who visited Rasputin regularly for spiritual guidance. Their sessions began with prayer, but over time he began asking her to confess, not her usual sins, but her fantasies. He would ask questions like, "What is it you desire when no one is watching?" She would whisper things she'd never said aloud, not to her husband, not to her priest. He would nod, then tell her God forgave her before she had even asked. In time, those confessions became touch, gentle at first, a hand on her thigh as she knelt, a thumb brushing her lips as she cried, and then, slowly, more. She wrote in a private letter that he told her, "When you lay with me, you lay with God's will. There is no shame in redemption." Others were less discreet. At certain parties in St. Petersburg, Rasputin's name was spoken like a dare. Women joked about having been purified, always with a nervous laugh. Husbands would glare. Some issued threats. One even challenged him to a duel. Rasputin laughed in his face and walked away untouched. It wasn't just his words, it was his aura, his scent. The strange mix of incense, alcohol, and something primal. The way he never rushed, never blinked too quickly, never flinched. Even his filth seemed deliberate, like he was above bathing, above pleasing anyone but God. In private, women said he would lock the door behind them and say, "You are not in sin, you are in grace." Then he would slowly undress, not her, but himself first, as if she were witnessing a ritual. His chest was lean, scarred, his hair matted. He would not kiss. He would press, heavy, unmoving, until the room felt full of smoke and heat. He left marks, fingernails, teeth, whispers in the dark. But the next day, he would greet them like nothing had happened, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a wink, sometimes not at all. And they always came back. There were rumors of full-blown orgies in candle-lit rooms. He would select 3 or 4 women at a time, wives of dukes, mistresses of generals, and guide them in what he called spiritual cleansing. They would fast for a day, pray together, then strip as he quoted the Psalms. One woman said he made them bathe him, gently, as if they were tending to a wounded saint. He would sit in the water, eyes closed, speaking of visions. Then he would rise, soaking wet, and lead them to bed. None of these stories could be publicly confirmed, of course, but they spread like wildfire, and in that, Rasputin found even more power. He didn't care if people believed them. In fact, it worked better if they didn't know what to believe. He was a prophet to some, a pervert to others, a wizard, a liar, a mystic, a madman. The uncertainty only fed his myth. At parties, women would blush and turn away when he entered, but sneak glances as he passed. Men would scowl, but avoid direct eye contact. Even priests walked with caution. The press began calling him the Holy Devil. Pamphlets depicted him as a satyr, half man, half beast, dragging noblewomen into the flames. One caricature showed Rasputin leering through a stained glass window while Alexandra lay weeping at the altar. And still, the Tsarina defended him. She believed the rumors were slander from jealous men. She insisted Rasputin was a pure soul, holy, misunderstood, targeted because of his gift. But her insistence only made the gossip worse. If Rasputin could seduce the wives of generals, could he seduce a queen? The idea was unthinkable, treasonous. But some nobles swore they had seen too much, letters written in Alexandra's delicate hand, far too intimate for a mere healer. She called him my only light, my soul's protector, the angel in the dark. Rasputin himself never spoke about it. When asked directly, he would grin and say, God places love where it must grow. And that was the end of it. The scandal eventually reached across Europe. Foreign ambassadors reported home about the bizarre relationship between the Empress and the Siberian mystic. In London, the British press mocked Russia for letting a half-mad monk steer the empire's future. In Berlin, he was labeled a sex sorcerer. In Paris, they called him an erotic revolutionary. But Rasputin only grew bolder. He now demanded private audiences with ministers. He advised the Tsarina on matters of state. He dismissed bishops who disrespected him. He publicly insulted generals, sometimes while drunk, calling them cowards. When he passed through St. Petersburg, women still followed. They would wait near his home, hoping to catch his eye. Some brought gifts. One brought her wedding ring and offered it as a symbol of devotion. He took it, kissed her forehead, and disappeared inside. There was even talk that he had begun mentoring younger men in the ways of spiritual seduction, that he saw himself as the founder of a new religious order where pleasure and prophecy walked hand in hand. It wasn't just lust that drew people in, it was surrender. Rasputin offered something Russia had never known, the freedom to feel. In a society of silence and shame, he said, "Speak, confess, desire, take." And in that, he became not just a man, but a mirror. What you saw in him was what you needed: a savior, a devil, a lover, a con man, a prophet. The most dangerous thing about Rasputin wasn't that he seduced women, it was that he seduced everyone. As Rasputin's power over the royal court grew, so did the silence in the halls of the Winter Palace. Ministers lowered their voices when speaking his name. Generals stiffened when passing him in the corridor. Courtiers bowed to him not out of respect, but out of fear. Because Rasputin no longer needed to beg, persuade, or charm. Now, he simply commanded. It began quietly, with whispers in the ear of the Tsarina, a word about a bishop being too proud, a mutter about a minister being disloyal. And then, that official was gone, dismissed, replaced with someone Rasputin had personally recommended, usually someone inexperienced, often someone corrupt, always someone obedient. Within just a few years, Russia's political hierarchy had been reshuffled by a man with no title, no education, and no official position. His only qualification was access to the throne, to Alexandra, and by extension, to God. And then came the war. In 1914, Russia was pulled into the firestorm of the First World War. Millions of soldiers were sent to the front, ill-equipped, underfed, and barely trained. Casualties skyrocketed. Supplies ran out. Winter came. The battlefield became a graveyard. Nicholas, ever the idealist, decided to take personal command of the army. Against every advisor's warning, he left the capital to station himself at the front lines. He believed his presence would inspire the troops. But all it did was leave a vacuum in St. Petersburg. Into that vacuum stepped two figures, Alexandra and Rasputin. While the Tsar rode through trenches, his wife ruled from the throne, and her closest and only advisor was the holy man in the robe who claimed to hear God. Rasputin began hand-picking ministers for key government positions, not based on loyalty to Russia, but loyalty to him. Some were his drinking companions, others were lovers of women in his circle. A few were just cowards who knew how to stay quiet. Russia's government began to rot from within. Competent officials were ousted for imagined offenses. Honest voices were silenced as traitors. Even some of the Tsar's cousins began sending secret letters begging him to return to the capital. They warned that Alexandra was under a spell. that Rasputin was sabotaging the war effort, that the people were turning. But Nicholas refused to believe it. He trusted Alexandra, and she trusted Rasputin. So the empire continued, directionless and bleeding, as decisions were made in back rooms, by a mystic monk who only months before had been preaching sin as salvation. Meanwhile, Rasputin became increasingly erratic. He drank constantly, wandered into taverns, and boasted that he controlled the government. He would name-drop generals, ministers, and bishops he'd destroyed. He spoke as if Russia was his possession, his vision, his punishment, his masterpiece. He once told a journalist, "If I die or am killed, the Tsar will fall within 6 months. Russia will burn, and not even Christ will save it." At first, people laughed. But they stopped laughing when Rasputin began predicting actual events. He foresaw troop movements before official reports were sent. He warned of a failed offensive days before it happened. He told Alexandra to replace one general with another, claiming the first would die within a week. And then he did. Some believed he had spies. Others believed he had demonic insight. But everyone began to believe he knew things. That fear grew into paranoia. The church, once tolerant of his presence, now turned fully against him. Archbishops accused him of heresy, of blasphemy, of mocking God with his debauchery and delusions. But their complaints were buried. The nobility, enraged by his seductions and meddling, sent delegations to the Tsar, pleading for Rasputin's removal. They begged Nicholas to return to the capital, to take control, to silence this impostor before it was too late. But Alexandra intercepted many of those pleas. She dismissed them as poison, jealousy, lies. She was convinced that Rasputin alone held Russia together, and while she believed, he ruled. He had no military rank, but decided strategy. No medical training, yet he dictated who treated the Tsarevich. No political education, but controlled appointments to the Duma. Even foreign ambassadors began to report back to their governments that Russia's fate is being decided in a back room by a drunken mystic and a hysterical empress. And the people began to riot, not just in whispers or rumors, but in the streets. Bread shortages turned into food riots. The wounded returned home to find no jobs, no homes, no answers. And everywhere they looked, they saw Rasputin's shadow. He had become the symbol of everything corrupt and insane in the Russian monarchy. People spat when they said his name. Priests condemned him from pulpits. Revolutionaries began distributing pamphlets showing Rasputin dancing while the empire burned. They called him the disease, the cancer, the parasite inside the Tsar's brain. And yet, he walked the streets untouched, because they feared him, because Alexandra protected him, because somehow he always knew who was plotting next. But even Rasputin, with all his visions and instincts, could not see how far the rot had spread. Behind the silk curtains of aristocratic estates, noblemen were no longer whispering. They were planning. Generals, princes, even members of the extended Romanov family. They believed Rasputin had destroyed Russia from within, that he had corrupted the Tsarina, weakened the Tsar, and broken the divine trust between ruler and ruled. They had sent letters, they had prayed, they had warned, but Rasputin still stood. And so, the only option left was to make him fall. Chapter 6. Attempts on his life. Grigory Rasputin had made many enemies, but he never made them quietly. By 1914, there wasn't a corner of the Russian elite untouched by his shadow. In salons and palaces, His name burned like incense, heavy, inescapable, suffocating. He had seduced the nobility, humiliated the clergy, and replaced ministers like broken shoes. His hands reached into the military, the church, the throne. And those hands were dirty. But no one could touch him. Not politically, not spiritually, not physically. He was untouchable, or so it seemed. The first serious attempt to end Rasputin's life came from someone unexpected. Not a noble, not a rival priest, not a foreign agent, but a woman. Kionia Guseva was a peasant, a former prostitute, and, some say, a disciple of one of Rasputin's oldest religious rivals, a monk named Iliador, who had once been Rasputin's friend before turning against him in disgust. Iliador had accused Rasputin of being the Antichrist in robes. He preached against Rasputin's seductions, his heresies, his drunken hypocrisy. He stirred the crowd, and Guseva was listening. On July 12, 1914, Rasputin was visiting his home region in Siberia. It was meant to be a moment of calm, a break from court, from scandal, from whispers. But fate doesn't care for scenery. As Rasputin stepped out of a bathhouse in the small town of Pokrovskoye, Guseva approached him. She wore a long peasant dress, her arms hidden, her face pale. She called out to him. He turned to respond, recognizing nothing in her eyes but supplication. And then she struck. A long dagger pierced straight into his gut. A second stab aimed for his heart. She screamed, "I have killed the Antichrist!" Rasputin collapsed into the snow, blood pouring from his abdomen. His intestines spilled from the wound. He screamed, tried to rise, then collapsed again. Villagers ran toward the sound. They found him gasping, soaked in crimson, his beard sticky with vomit and frost. He should have died, but he didn't. The wound was catastrophic. Doctors operated for hours. He hovered at death's door for days, barely breathing, fevered and twitching, muttering about visions of hell and fire and angels who refused to speak. But slowly, he came back. Weeks later, he was walking. Months later, he returned to St. Petersburg, thinner, paler, but alive. And this time, something had changed. He believed the wound had purified him, that his blood had been offered as a sacrifice for Russia's soul. He spoke of his survival not as luck, but as proof that death could not take him unless he allowed it. To the Tsarina, his recovery confirmed everything. God had protected him. He was chosen. If her enemies could not kill Rasputin, then they could not kill her son, her throne, her faith. But to his enemies, Rasputin's survival only made him more terrifying. The man would not die. And worse, he seemed even stronger. After the attack, Rasputin became more erratic, more consumed with visions. He claimed he could see the future. He stopped trusting anyone outside the royal family. He drank more, raved louder, locked himself in rooms for days, scribbling strange symbols on scraps of paper and burning them. He saw plots in every conversation. He trusted only Alexandra, only the palace, only the boy. He began warning the Empress, "I will die soon, and if I do, it will be the end of you." The warning wasn't poetic, it wasn't vague, it was a promise. He told her, "If I am killed by peasants, by common hands, you will be safe. But if your blood kills me, if your nobles spill my blood, then your son will die, and the throne will fall, and all of Russia will drown in fire." Alexandra wept. She begged him not to go out in public, to stay within the palace, to rest. But Rasputin no longer feared death. He had seen it, spoken to it, and come back with the smell of the grave still clinging to his robes. He walked the city like a ghost. He stared too long at people, laughed at nothing. He'd sit for hours in total silence, then explode in furious shouts that the devil was crawling under the walls. And all the while, more enemies gathered. Men with titles, men with guns, men with lineages that traced back centuries. They weren't frightened boys or wild-eyed fanatics like Guseva. They were methodical, calculated, well-bred, and they were done waiting. They believed Rasputin was the infection that had blackened the Romanov soul, that he had turned Alexandra into a puppet, destroyed the Tsar's credibility, and opened the gates to revolution with every drunken appointment and foolish whisper. They didn't hate Rasputin because he was evil. They hated him because he had won. A man from nothing, illiterate, barefoot, uncultured, had outmaneuvered the most powerful men in Russia. He had conquered the monarchy with only his voice and his eyes. That was unforgivable. And so, late in 1916, as winter smothered St. Petersburg in silence, they made a final decision. This time, there would be no warnings, no public arrests, no failed stabbings in the snow. Rasputin would die, and the empire would be saved. Chapter 7. The Legendary Assassination. The year was 1916. Russia was drowning. On the front lines, soldiers froze in trenches with no boots, no bullets, and no hope. In the cities, workers rioted for bread. Revolution simmered beneath the snow. The people had lost faith in the Tsar, and even those who once served the throne now looked towards something darker, inevitable. And still, Rasputin lived. He wandered through palace halls like he owned them, whispered to ministers in candlelit rooms, laid his hands on the Tsarevich, and murmured prayers between swigs of wine. The press called him a monster, a sex-mad fraud, a traitor in holy robes. But he smiled through it all. He had survived every scandal, every accusation, even a blade that nearly gutted him. But this time, he would not survive what came next. Because now, his enemies weren't writing letters. They were sharpening knives. At the center of the plot was a young aristocrat, Prince Felix Yusupov, wealthy, educated, married into the Romanov family itself. He was everything Rasputin was not, noble by blood, refined by Parisian taste, and utterly humiliated that the empire had become a puppet show controlled by a peasant mystic. He wanted Rasputin gone, but not just killed. He wanted Rasputin erased. And so, Felix began to gather co-conspirators, a Grand Duke, a member of the Duma, a doctor, a few loyal military men. All of them agreed. The only way to save the monarchy was to slaughter its shadow. The plan was simple in theory, almost theatrical in execution. On the night of December 29, 1916, Felix sent word to Rasputin. He invited him to his family's palace on the Moika River, said there was a private gathering, wine, women, a favor to ask, something important, just the two of them. Rasputin agreed. He was warned, of course. He always was. Warnings circled him like flies, but he ignored them. He had grown used to surviving everything. He put on his usual black coat, his worn boots, and stepped into the freezing night for the last time. The palace was quiet, too quiet. Felix greeted him warmly, led him down into the basement, a lavishly furnished chamber lit with candles, music playing softly, a table set with cakes and fine wine. Rasputin sat. They talked, laughed, toasted, all while Felix watched every bite, because the cakes were poisoned, laced with potassium cyanide, enough to kill a man several times over. Rasputin took a piece, then another. He sipped the wine. Nothing happened. Felix began to panic. He offered more, poured more. Still, Rasputin sat smiling, a bit drunk, talking about politics and women and snow. Minutes passed, then an hour. And still, Rasputin lived. Felix excused himself. Upstairs, the other conspirators waited in growing terror. Was the poison old? Was Rasputin immune? Was he, as some believed, not human at all? They decided to act. Felix returned, this time with a revolver in his coat. He poured another drink, waited until Rasputin stood to leave, and then, as the mystic turned his back, he shot him once in the chest. Rasputin gasped, collapsed. The conspirators cheered, toasted. The devil was dead. But the story wasn't over. Hours later, as they prepared to dispose of the body, Felix returned to the basement one last time, to look upon the corpse, to savor the victory. And that's when Rasputin's eyes snapped open. He lunged forward, clawed at Felix's throat, blood pouring from his chest, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wild with hatred. He ran, staggered up the stairs, burst through the door into the snow-covered courtyard. Blood soaked his tunic, steaming in the cold. He ran across the icy stones, slipping, screaming. One witness said he looked like a man aflame, staggering through his own funeral. Behind him, the assassins panicked. They chased him. Another shot rang out, missed. A third hit him in the back. Rasputin dropped to his knees, groaned, then began to crawl. A fourth shot to the head. He finally collapsed. Felix approached, took the pistol, and for good measure, shot Rasputin once more in the forehead. Still, some say he twitched. They bound his body in heavy chains, wrapped it in a curtain, and dragged him through the snow toward the Malaya Nevka River, where they hacked a hole through the ice and tossed him into the dark water below. They believed it was over. But the autopsy would later reveal something strange. Rasputin had water in his lungs, which meant he was still breathing when they threw him into the river. He died drowning, not from bullets, not from poison, but from the icy silence of Russia's winter. And in that silence, the myth was born. Within hours, his death consumed the empire. The Tsarina collapsed. The Tsar raged. The streets buzzed with whispers. Some called the murder divine justice. Others called it the beginning of the end. The conspirators expected to be praised, but they were not. Instead, they were condemned, banished, hunted, because Rasputin's death did not save the monarchy. It cursed it. Just weeks later, revolution erupted in full. The Romanov dynasty collapsed. Nicholas abdicated the throne. Alexandra was imprisoned. Rasputin's prophecy came true. Alexei, the boy he had sworn to protect, died in a cellar beside his parents, executed by Bolshevik rifles. And Rasputin, the man no one could kill, was now the most famous corpse in Russian history. He was buried in a secret grave, but even that wouldn't last. In 1917, when the provisional government took over, they exhumed his remains. Some say they burned them. Some say they were dumped and lost to history. Others, whisperers, believers, say his bones were taken by followers, scattered to the winds like relics of a dark saint. But the truth is, Rasputin never really died. He became a ghost, a legend, a symbol of power, of corruption, of mysticism and madness, of how empires fall not from war, but from within. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Collapse. The river froze over within hours of swallowing Rasputin's body. The chains meant to hold him down sank into the ice, disappearing from view, like the empire he once haunted. But he was not gone. Not truly. Because the man had never just been a man. He was a symbol, a disease, a prophecy. And now that he was dead, the final act had already begun. News of Rasputin's death swept through St. Petersburg. Petersburg like a plague. It wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just politics. It was fear. Because for all the hatred, for all the satire and slander and scandal, people believed Rasputin had been holding something back, that without him, something worse would break loose. Even his murderers weren't at ease. Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's richest families, and the man who pulled the trigger, fled the capital immediately. His hands were stained, not just with blood, but with dread. He had killed the devil. But now the sky looked darker, and in the Winter Palace, the Tsarina fell into grief like it was a coffin. She refused to eat. She refused to speak. She clutched Rasputin's final letters against her chest like relics. Wrote to Nicholas, "They have taken our only hope. The wolves circle now, my love." Nicholas returned days later from the front lines, his face gaunt, lips chapped by frost and failure. He'd left an empire in crisis and returned to a graveyard. But he was too late. Not just for Rasputin, for everything. The assassination hadn't saved the monarchy. It had cursed it. The nobles who believed killing Rasputin would restore dignity to the crown had made one critical mistake. They had removed the lightning rod, but left the storm. Without Rasputin to blame, the people now turned their rage toward the Tsar and Tsarina directly. The press stopped using satire. Now they used venom. Headlines called the royal family parasites. Pamphlets showed Alexandra painted as a German witch. Cartoons mocked Nicholas as a blind puppet clinging to a burning throne. And outside the palaces, the air turned heavy with frost and revolution. The war had dragged on far too long. Russian soldiers were being sent into the trenches with wooden rifles and cardboard boots. They froze where they stood. They starved where they lay. They rebelled when they returned home. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Factories went silent. Protests became riots. Riots became fire. And then came February. Not a bomb, not a military coup, but women. It started with women in the streets of Petrograd demanding bread for their children. Factory workers joined them, then students, then soldiers. Nicholas ordered the uprising crushed, but the troops refused. They dropped their rifles, joined the crowds, cheered for the fall of the empire they once bled for. In just a matter of days, the entire city was under the people's control. The royal family, once godlike, untouchable, was now trapped in a palace full of dust and memory. Nicholas tried to issue decrees, but there was no one left to obey them. The Duma declared a provisional government. His cousins stopped answering letters. His advisors vanished into exile. Even the church offered only silence. On March 15, 1917, the Tsar signed the abdication papers. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a signature and a sigh. He handed the empire not to a son, not to a brother, but to a question mark. And then he went home, not to a throne, but to house arrest. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children were moved from palace to estate, from estate to safe house, always accompanied by guards, always under surveillance. Their titles were stripped, their jewels seized, their servants dismissed. But still, Alexandra clung to hope. She believed God was testing her, that Rasputin's death was only a dark valley before the final miracle. She prayed daily, lit candles to his name, read his letters aloud to the children. She even kept a small icon of Rasputin's face beside her bed. But Nicholas knew He saw it in the guards' faces, in their silence, in the way the food portions grew smaller, the halls colder, the windows more tightly sealed. He spent his days chopping wood, fixing broken furniture, anything to keep his hands busy, anything to pretend time hadn't stopped. Alexei grew weaker. His joints flared. His bleeding returned. The boy who once laughed at Rasputin's silly stories now cried at night, asking if the holy man could still see him. By the summer of 1918, the Bolsheviks had taken power. The royal family was now considered not just irrelevant, but dangerous. And on the night of July 16th, in a small house in Yekaterinburg, the guards came for them. They said it was time to move the family for their safety, that the White Army was approaching, that the new government had arranged a transport. They were led into the basement, told to wait, told to pose for a photo, to prove they were alive. Then a squad of men entered with rifles and bayonets. No announcements, no speeches, only bullets. The Tsar was killed first, then Alexandra, then the children. The youngest, Anastasia, survived the first volley. Her corset, stuffed with family diamonds, had acted as armor. But she was stabbed, over and over, until she stopped screaming. By morning, there was no Romanov left alive, just bones in a shallow grave, just silence where a dynasty once stood. And somewhere in that silence, Rasputin's final prophecy echoed, "If I am killed by nobles, your blood will flood the earth, you will fall within 2 years, and Russia will become a land of death." He had been right. The revolution that followed claimed millions, civil war, purges, starvation. The empire was buried under red flags and black earth. But Rasputin's name survived. The Soviets erased him from textbooks, banned his likeness. But in whispers and shadows, he grew stronger. In Paris, exiled nobles spoke of him like a demon. In Berlin, writers called him a mystic. In America, headlines called him immortal. He was resurrected again and again, in books, in plays, in films, in nightmares. A man who had touched the hem of royalty and turned it to rot. His daughter, Maria Rasputin, lived into the 1970s. She worked as a cabaret dancer, a circus lion tamer, an author. She said her father wasn't evil, that he was a misunderstood healer, that his only crime was being too close to power. Maybe she believed it. Maybe we all believe our ghosts are better than they really were. But Rasputin's legacy was never about truth. It was about belief. And in Russia, belief is more dangerous than bullets. Final chapter. Legacy. Rasputin died in the snow. Chained, shot, drowned, his body pulled from a frozen river like a monster finally slain. And yet, more than 100 years later, he refuses to disappear. He still lives, in books, in songs, in horror stories whispered in candlelit rooms. He is remembered not just as a man, but as a myth, as a warning, as a fascination the world can't seem to shake. Because Grigory Rasputin was never just about what he did. He was about what people believed he could do. Even his enemies, even the people who despised him, spoke of him like a force of nature. They didn't call him a liar or a fraud. They called him a demon, a hypnotist, a vessel of hell. He had no title, no army, no political education, no wealth, and yet he became the most powerful man in Russia for a time. How? It wasn't power he chased, it was people. Rasputin had an unnatural ability to see the hunger in others, to look past the smiles and uniforms and jewelry, and speak to the parts of people they hid from the world. And once he found that crack, he widened it, with kindness, with seduction, with faith. He told the broken that they were beautiful. He told the repressed that their desires were holy. He told the powerful that their enemies were beneath them. He gave everyone exactly what they wanted and demanded loyalty in return. Was it manipulation? Probably. Was it charisma? Undeniably. Was it evil? That's harder to say. Some saw him as a healer, a peasant prophet, a holy fool in a corrupt world. Others saw him as the devil incarnate, grinning, lustful, corrupt, infecting the last great Christian empire from within. But the truth, as always, lives somewhere in the space between story and silence. In the years after his death, Rasputin's legend grew bigger than the man ever was. Hollywood painted him as a vampire. Soviet textbooks blamed him for the fall of an empire. Western mystics tried to imitate him, some even claiming to channel his spirit in seances. He was reborn in theater, in fiction, in music. He became a villain in animated films, a sorcerer in comics, a disco icon in pop culture. Yes, even there. In 1978, the German band Boney M released a bizarre hypnotic track called Rasputin. It told of a lover of the Russian queen, a man who was Russia's greatest love machine. It was catchy, ridiculous, wildly inaccurate, and it became a hit. Because Rasputin was no longer just a figure from history. He had become folklore. The kind of story that survives not because it is true, but because it refuses to die. He was everything we fear and everything we crave, a prophet who touched power, a seducer who defied shame, a peasant who walked with kings. Some say he was a mirror, reflecting the decadence, desire, and desperation of a dying empire. Others say he was the match that lit the fire. But what made him unforgettable wasn't just what he did, it was how we responded. Russia made him a monster. The world turned him into a myth. And history, strangely, reluctantly, couldn't let him go. Because Grigory Rasputin is the story of what happens when belief outweighs truth, when seduction replaces reason, when fear becomes faith. He did not destroy Russia with weapons. He did it with whispers, with charm, with the quiet madness of a man who believed he was chosen, and made others believe it too. And in the end, maybe that's the scariest part, because monsters can be killed. But belief spreads. And Rasputin, dead or alive, still has people under his spell.